Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to TransCelerate's public webinar today, introducing Let's Make a PV Agreement, 3 solutions you can use to enhance your PVA process. Next slide. TransCelerate is a non-for-profit entity created to foster collaboration. Our mission is to collaborate across the global biopharma R&D community to identify, prioritize, design, and facilitate the implementation of solutions designed to drive efficient, effective, and high quality delivery of new medicines. Our vision is to improve the health of people around the world by accelerating and simplifying the research and development of innovative new therapies. Next slide. We are a member-driven mission. Our members are passionate about designing solutions to address R&D's most complex challenges related to clinical development and drug safety. Since 2012, passionate leaders and subject matter experts from TransCelerate member companies have volunteered their time to design, develop, deliver, and socialize solutions to advance the TransCelerate mission. TransCelerate has designed, developed, and delivered 400+ solutions and implementation tools to address the R&D ecosystem pain points and transformational opportunities. Most solutions are free for public download and use. Next slide. Just a couple of ground rules before we get started with today. We want to make this discussion helpful and answer as many of your questions as we can. But participation is voluntary, as is using TransCelerate assets and tools. The responsibility for compliance with laws and regulations is owned by the solution adopter, and you do not have to identify what company you work for. Things that we would ask you not to discuss: what vendors, sites, CROs, customers, or clients you are doing business with or not, and what tech products or services you are using or not. Any issues you have with any vendors, sites, CROs, tech products, or services and customers or clients. Your long-term development plans, and also anything related to costs or prices. We cannot answer questions about vendors, costs of using or implementing TransCelerate assets and tools, and which member companies are using specific vendors or products or any TransCelerate assets or tools. Next slide, please. Just some basic logistics for today's webinar. Please note that all participants have been muted for this call in order to ensure a pleasant listening experience for all attendees. You may reduce the GoToWebinar control panel for a better view of the presentation by clicking the orange and white arrow in the upper right corner. We also welcome questions throughout the discussion. These can be submitted using the questions function you should also see in your control panel. Be sure to click send after typing your question in the box. If your question is not answered during the Q&A, we encourage you to send your questions or feedback to info@tranceleratebiopharmainc.com. And as a reminder, this webinar may be recorded in whole or in part. Next slide, please. We have a number of our team members from the PVAO workstream joining us today who will present all that they've been involved in developing these solutions. They are also subject matter experts representing a variety of our member companies. My name is Ashley Pachter. I'm the event moderator. I'd like to introduce you to and welcome Anna Maria Bornemann, Alliance Management Senior Expert from Bayer, Jean Kilger-Cliffy, Deputy EU QPPV from Novartis, and Jennifer Whitaker, Senior PV Process Director from Roche. So without further ado, I have the pleasure of presenting Jennifer Whitaker. Jennifer, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Ashley. Can I get to the first slide, please? Great, and I'll just give a quick introduction to the webinar. So if we can move to the next slide. Just to start off with, I'd just like to go through the agenda for today's webinar. So we'll start off with this introduction, and then we'll move into discussions around the solutions. We'll start off with the process map, the table of contents, and then lastly, the glossary solutions. Then we'll have a summary of the webinar, and then an opportunity for questions and answers. Next slide, please. And the purpose of today's webinar. What we hope is the audience will be able to learn about tools and solutions that could help improve efficiency across the PVA lifecycle. Some questions that we hope you'll be able to answer are, how can these tools help you in your role? But also, how can these tools potentially help other functions that you might interact with within the PVA lifecycle? We do really want your thoughts and feedback on these tools, and potentially also maybe some ideas of where to go next. So please submit feedback and questions in the chat. We really do love to hear from you. Okay, next slide, please. So we have a couple of poll questions for the audience. So if we move to the first question, that should appear. If you could please indicate your level of experience with PVAs. And so if just give you a minute to select the answer. Okay, I think we'll give a few more seconds to people. Okay, so you can see the results from the poll, and it looks like we do have a spread of experience. And hopefully, whether you have less than a year of experience or are very experienced with over 10 years, you will take something away from the webinar. So if we can move to the second question. We'd like to see, what is your role in the PVA process? Please do select all that apply, and we'll give, again, another minute for people to answer this question. Okay, if we just give a few more seconds to wrap up the poll. Okay, great. So again, it looks like we have a nice spread of people. So we have people who are authoring as well as reviewing. So that seems to mean the majority, as well as those who need to implement the PVAs and other roles as well. And those who might be new to the PVA process and haven't currently had any work. So great, thank you very much. So if we can move on. Okay. So to start off with, what is the purpose of a pharmacovigilance agreement? So really at a high level, a PVA is an agreement between companies, and it's there to outline safety data exchange and responsibilities between the companies. So in these type of relationships, they may vary, but the overall responsibility for the PV system remains with the MAH and or sponsor. Business relationships that affect the PV system are documented in PVAs as required by regulations. Because of this, PVAs are a critical part of the PV system, and they allow the MAH or sponsor to fulfill the obligations not only towards the health authorities, but also their business partners. And for those who have worked on PVAs, you know that PVAs and the management of them requires time, resource, and expertise, and that the failure to have a PVA in place in a timely manner may result in delays in key milestones, such as clinical trial start, launch, and/or asset transfer, and also may result in inspection and audit findings. Next slide, please. So we've established the importance of PVAs. Now, one of the things within the member companies is we noticed that there were common challenges amongst the companies, and this is what led to the Pharmacovigilance Agreements Optimization Initiative. So on the left-hand side, these were the challenges we saw. We had ambiguous contractual language and definitions in the PVA, lengthy negotiation periods and protracted negotiations, as well as long contractual maintenance. And as these business relationships are, within a changing landscape, so you have introducing medical devices or gene therapy or other ATMPs, you're seeing increased complexity of PVA structures and content. And lastly, there's a lack of awareness about operational timelines for data exchange. So this can lead to misalignment and delays in finalization of PVAs. So because of this, we created the initiative with the following goal. Really is to create solutions that can help generate efficiencies and support compliance in the development and performance of tasks that are commonly included throughout the end-to-end PVA lifecycle. Next slide. We have another poll, so if we can open up the question. What is your biggest challenge in the PVA process? So please select one. So do you have problems with ambiguous contractual terms and definitions? Lengthy negotiation periods and contractual maintenance? Are you seeing complexity of PVA structures and content? Is there a lack of awareness of operational timelines for data exchange? Or is it all of the above? Or can I add more? Thank you. So I'll give you, again, a minute to answer this question. Okay. Great, and it does look like there's a spread, but it looks as the majority also have found the same problems, that all of these challenges are presenting themselves in the PVA process. Fantastic. So if we can move on. So what are the solutions in the PVA initiative? We have, first of all, the process map, which provides a guidance on the PVA process. There's a glossary, which has common understanding of key terminology. We also have the table of contents, which provides a framework of headings and points to consider for PVA creation. And lastly, we're currently working on timelines benchmarking, which will provide aggregate benchmarking data on exchange timelines with a target for launch of 2023. Next slide, please. So where can you find our solutions? Well, if you go to the TransCelerate website, so TransCelerateBiopharmaInc.com, you will see on the upper left-hand side a tab that says Our Solutions. If you click on that, it will bring you to the Our Solutions page. And under Enhanced Drug Safety, you'll see All Initiatives, and you can select on Pharmacovigilance Agreements Optimization. And if you click on that, that will bring you to the home page where you can access all the solutions. Great. Next slide, please. And now I'd like to hand it over to Anna Maria to discuss the process map.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm going to present the process map. Next slide, please. So how was the process map developed? We brought together different processes from the member companies and compared them. And through feedback and review, the initiative synthesized those maps into one PVA lifecycle process map. While doing this, we identified several challenges across the PVA lifecycle. And with this, tools were developed to address these challenges or inefficiencies and embed into an interactive process map to help users. Next slide, please. Here you can see the interactive process map, which you can see on the website that was indicated before. And you see every step that has a bolded outline has tools available. I will focus on the pre-PVA involvement of PV function tool, as well as the PVA review checklist and documentation tool, whereas Jean and Jennifer will focus on the glossary and the table of contents solution. Next slide, please. So one of the challenges that was identified was that the PV function is not involved early on in main agreement negotiations, which in turn delays the finalization and execution of the PVA. So if you click on the process map step with the bold outline for more information, you will find the pre-PVA involvement of PV function slide deck tool to educate internal stakeholders on the importance of involving PV early on. Next slide, please. So if you click on the bolded outline, this is where you find the tool. First, the one side will open, and then you will have the next window if you click here, and then you can download the PowerPoint slides. Next slide, please. So let's take a look inside these downloaded slides. The slide deck has two parts. The first part addresses the PV function, and the second part is to socialize with non-PV functions. Both slide decks are customizable slides on how to build build and foster internal collaboration with the relevant stakeholders. And then the second slide part is really how to convince your stakeholders to involve PV early on. Next slide, please. So, why it is important to have PV involvement before a PVA is created, and why it is important to convince people to involve PV early on. It is first of all essential to have well-structured processes, but processes are run and managed and supported by people, and people are driven by purpose. So if people see a purpose, your well-structured processes work better. So you have to ask yourself, does my organization understand why PV involvement is needed in new partnerships and why PVAs are necessary? Next slide, please. So here are a few talking points that you can use to convince your organization. So first of all, if PV is involved early on, that supports enhanced patient and product safety. It enables compliance with regulations and health authority expectations. At the same time, it helps to strengthen your reputation as a trustful and reliable business partner. And also, early involvement may help mitigate delays to the overall project timelines. Next slide, please. So we had the issue that PV functions were not involved early on in main agreement negotiations, which led to delayed finalization and execution of the PVA. Now, if you use the pre-PVA involvement of PV function slide deck tool to educate internal stakeholders on the importance of involving PV early on, what you get is, next slide please, that you have an improved involvement of PV function during main agreement negotiations and no surprises about new business contracts, which in turn helps the that PVA negotiation is initiated and executed on time. Next slide, please. In addition, it is considered helpful to consider PVA development as a project. So what are the 5 steps you need for efficient PVA negotiations? First of all, you need the resources. Then you need to understand the scope of the business setup. You need to agree on the tasks. You need to agree on timing, and communication between the parties is important. Next slide, please. So here you can find on the TransCelerate website a kickoff agenda slide deck that you can use for your PVA project. The first meeting, the meeting between you and the partner to tackle the PVA as a project. Now let's go into the slides what such a meeting could cover. Next slide. Next slide. So the agenda of such a meeting would include stakeholder introductions, getting a common understanding of the business setup, alignment on principles of PV collaboration, agree on PVA drafting and finalization timeline, and document meeting outcome and actions. Next slide. Start with the introduction of the stakeholders and define their role in the PVA process. This way, once you have the draft, you can start addressing the questions right to the correct person, as well as identifying if you might be still missing a function. Next slide. Then get a common understanding of the business situation. What product is in scope? What is the marketing authorization status of the product? What is the territory that is covered? What is the role of the contractual parties? What is the general project plan? And which PV clauses do you need? And any other item that is important for the specific PVA. Next slide, please. So you can also agree on certain principles of the PV collaboration early on. Who holds the global safety database? Will there be separate safety databases per marketing authorization holder? Will there be mirrored safety databases, for example, like in a co-development setting? Will there be a governance body, and what governance bodies need to be established? Which party's PVA template is used? And what data exchange formats will you be using? Other topics that might be relevant for your situation could be legacy safety data transfer. Is that needed? What should be the general structure and content of the PVA? And do both parties accept e-signatures? Next slide, please. Then agree on PVA drafting and finalization timeline. Discuss how much time you actually need for each step in the PVA negotiation. And for that, we developed a tool, which you can see on the next slide. This is a Gantt chart that is also available on the TransCelerate website, where you can enter the date you need to have your PVA finalized, and from that point backwards can calculate how much time you can take for each review step that is required. Next slide. And once you have documented all these decisions, you can go on and draft your PVA and finalize it. But after PVA development and implementation, PVAs are maintained. And for this, we developed the PVA review checklist and documentation tool, which you can see here in the screenshot, which is a checklist of what items you can check when you have review your PVAs. Next slide, please. So one member company had the situation that they had a review period documented in their PVAs and associated standard operating procedures. And teams must confirm their reviews within a system that generates core process compliance metrics. But the challenge was that historically, affiliate teams within the member company acknowledged challenges with understanding the purpose of periodic PVA reviews and what the entire process entails and what should be checked or verified. Therefore, there was a hesitancy to confirm the completion of the reviews, resulting in process non-compliance. These difficulties posed an audit, both internal and partner company, and inspection risk. So what actions did the company take? In early 2022, colleagues from the international pharmacovigilance team, in collaboration with the relevant process owner, used the periodic PVA review checklist as a reference and incorporated key elements such as whether the PVA reflects the current template into the affiliate PV guidance. These resulted in certain benefits after 6 months. There were no queries received, no late reviews reported. That in the end improved the results for the process compliance metrics. There was a global consistency for that approach, and it was the ideal documentation of the PVA review process from an audit readiness perspective. Thank you very much, and I hand it over to Jean now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. So, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And I'm going to talk you through the table of contents. So if we go to the next slide, let's take a look at the table of contents and how it's structured. So there are 4 modules with headings, subheadings, and points to consider, covering clinical trials and post-marketing life cycles, and also covering several product types. And this was designed to be flexible for different types of agreements and also for different company structures. So let's take a look at how it was developed and where the table of contents came from. So next slide, please. So the table of contents actually began with a list of headings from all the member companies in the project, or many of the member companies in the project, and it was approximately 15, 17 companies. This was about 750 rows of Excel with a different number of different words, sentence structure, acronyms, synonyms, but all for the same thing. So how did we go about it? Firstly, we deduplicated all of the headings, and this resulted in 388 lines. And then we started to combine similar topics and similar headings. Following a review of all of this classification, the team came up with an idea to propose a modular approach to a PV agreement. And this was based on experience really from different companies, and also the fact of the painful negotiations we have and reviewing partner documents. So the table of contents was never planned to be a template, but rather a nimble and flexible approach to identifying quickly what was required for an agreement. So hence was born the points to consider. And this was considered to be of more value, and these points to consider were brought together by the team and reviewed across the work streams. And then we went for some external engagement. So this has been quite extensively reviewed. It was reviewed by industry associations, research collaborations, subject matter experts, internal companies, and all of the comments were looked at and addressed. So if we move to the next slide, let's take a look at why, a little bit more in depth, why we approach things in this way. So with a modular approach, we know as companies that we can review 1, 50, 100, or even more partner PV agreements, and every one of them can be different. So companies we all try to drive our own template because it's comfortable, because we know it. But what would happen if at least we had some structure that companies were using and things were grouped together in modules? And this would bring topics together that would be more helpful. For example, we have examples of this in our everyday lives in pharmacovigilance with PSUR templates and RMP templates, where you have a template that is a structure, but you can actually adapt it for different products, different life cycle time periods, etc. And this is where we were coming from with that thinking. So let's move now on to the next slide, and let's talk a little bit about the points to consider. So as I mentioned earlier, the table of contents wasn't planned to be a template, but it's taking a nimble, flexible approach. So what we looked at is what could we do to make this of value to people? How could we help people? So the points to consider were actually to allow for the fact that different companies have different experiences in different areas and different functions and across companies. And for example, legal and regulatory were also involved. So for each heading and subheading, what we did was look at what were the points that you should consider in this for different regions, product lifecycle, territories, and this could be used at the development of the PV agreement, the beginning and during the negotiation. So also we considered that having these points to consider could also help reduce negotiation times potentially if companies were aligned. And it's very comprehensive, and it's a guide, and it's a little bit like going into your favorite bakery or your favorite sweet shop or any other place where you can take what you want and leave the rest. So you can choose, you can pick and choose. And the idea was that it could be used as a guide for all levels, that there were lists for also for more expert people looking at the table of contents to see if anything was missing that they hadn't thought of, or for more junior people. And it can be used for a variety of different groups, and also for local countries as well as local organizations as well. So let's move to the next slide. And please don't get scared when you see this. It's very comprehensive, but there are 4 modules. The background, which is mainly administration, pharmacovigilance activities. This is very small writing, but we'll go into some more detail. And for example, you can see there the QPPV or aggregate reports. This brings together all the pharmacovigilance activities. Module 2 brings together the cooperation and support, such as QMS, training, governance. Module 4 is the appendices and annexes, and these can also be used if your PV agreement's small. You could adapt and use these in your core modules as well. And then the addenda, which we will talk about in a little bit more detail. We have 5 addenda. So let's move to the next slide, please. So let's take a look inside the talk and the table of contents. It's very easy to navigate through the navigation panel in PDF and through hyperlinks. In addition to which, we have Addendum 1. And why did we put it as an addendum? Well, it can be used for a number of different things, which we'll look at in a moment. But this gives you the hyperlinks to all of the sections of the document. So next slide, please. So how is it organized? As you see, here is module 2. And here we have a heading of organized data collection. And then we have some subheadings that you can see. The first one being data sources. And then within the table of contents, we also link to the glossary. So here we link the organized data collection to the glossary document. Then, where you see the colors at the top here, we have the US, EU, and Japan. And then we also have post-marketing and clinical trials. We looked, when we were looking at regulations, at ICH, US, EU, and Japan regulations. And what we've done is, these are the main regulations we'll work to. So in the column on the right-hand side, you have all of the references. Not all sections have references. For example, Module 1, which is more administration, may not have a reference. But where we've been able to actually add a reference. And then we also have a link, if you look at number 8, to the reference safety information, the RSI. So we have links across the table of contents. And then again, in number 9, we have a link to the glossary. So let's, that's an idea of what the table of contents looks like. It gives you an idea of the points to consider. In different sections, there are a different number of points to consider, looking at different areas such as the regions, maybe, or the clinical trial, highlighting some clinical trial areas, or post-marketing. So let's move to the next slide, please. So I mentioned Addendum 1. The first 2 addenda are more administrative, the second one being the acronyms. With Addendum 1, we felt it could be used in a number of different ways. It can be used, for example, as a checklist, if you want to take a look at what's in your PV agreement, comparing it to the table of contents. It can also be used as a checklist, for example, for audits and inspections. It could be used just to have a look to see if there is anything missing, or for discussion or for comparison. So let's move now to Addendum 3. This addendum on the next slide is actually a termination agreement, points to consider. This is the only addendum that can be used on its own, because we thought it would be useful to have a list, because termination agreements can sometimes just be a one-page document or can be incorporated in a different document. So this one can be used without the rest of the table of contents. So let's move to the next 2, Addendum 4 and 5. These are specific points related to combination products and to vaccines. These wouldn't be used on their own, but they would be used in addition to the table of contents, because these are actually have some additional information. So let's move on now to the next slide. And we're going to take a look at how the table of contents might work. So here we have a situation of a partner-generated PV agreement for a product that's not in development anymore. And someone comes to do it, and they have to look at the EU region only, and they want to identify those PV sections, but they've not got very much experience and the requirements of the EU. So what can they do? So let's move to the next slide. In the table of contents you saw earlier on, we have highlighted in the first orange bar, the EU. And you can see here that in some sections it continues down, in some sections it's blank. So where it is the orange bar, they can filter on this. And it can be filtered either with the colors, or it can be, if you have tools to filter, you could use your own tools, and you can find the EU sections. And for example, at the bottom, you have the PSMF as well. So what happened and what would be the outcome of this? So the outcome here on the next slide is that the table of contents was used to cross-check the PV agreement. The filters were applied, and this helped someone to feel more confident about what they're looking at. They also have the references, so they don't have to go and look up the references. They've got the references there, so they don't need to rely on their memory. Because as you get older like me, you can't necessarily rely on that all the time. So let's move to the next slide. So we have another example where the company is looking to augment their internal PV agreements guidance document. So here, you could be looking for a comprehensive source that can help greater alignment during negotiations. So the company does not have an established PVA template to use, or it might be that the company wants to really drastically improve their PV agreements template. So what can you do with a table of contents? So let's take a look to the next slide. So here we've talked about earlier using the table of contents where you have Addendum 1 as a checklist. So that will give you the headings and subheadings. So you could do a cross comparison. And then secondly, you could take the points to consider, because you may want to go into more detail and say, what are the things that we've covered or haven't covered? And then there may be that you want, in addition, to do some work with combination products or with vaccines, and may look at the addenda. So what would be the outcome, or could be the outcome here? Next slide, please. So here, it's using their talk as a reference guide. It's identifying areas where the guidance can be improved. And also, the template could be enhanced for efficiency, and the initial drafts could be aligned faster with partner expectations and potentially reduce the negotiation time. So let's move on to the final example. So this example, many of us come into new roles or come into new companies, and we have a whole load of training, and we have to go through all this training at the very beginning. And here we have a document which, as you see, is very extensive, and maybe the talk can be used to supplement the company training and supplement the template, because actually the talk could be maybe used as a guide, a Bible on your metaphorical desk or now your laptop, where you can go and take a look. So you might have had some training a few months ago, but want to go back and say, okay, so what about this section? What do I need to remember? So let's take a look at the outcome here. So here it could be used because as adults, we want to go away and look at our own things. So take a look. It could be used for training, improved training. Staff can become more knowledgeable. There could be smoother and faster negotiation, and also improving the PV agreement structure and the content as well, and the speed, because people remember what to put in. So let's now move to the next slide, in which I'm going to hand over now to Jennifer to talk about the glossary. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jean. And I'm here to give an overview of the glossary. Can we move to the next slide? Great, thank you. So what is the PVA glossary? Well, it provides common understanding of key terms that you'll find in a PVA, as well as reference information to support these terms. It includes, not surprisingly, definitions as well as synonyms. We also cover the product life cycle, so whether it's applicable to clinical trials and or post-marketing. It also covers multiple product types, such as medicinal and drug products, biologics, vaccines, and device component. You can move to the next slide. So how was the glossary developed? I can tell you there was a lot of work done for this. So at the beginning, we collected the terms for member companies' PVA templates. And from there, we had about 350 terms. So we reviewed them and aggregated and collated the results. And this included grouping synonyms. And yet we had only reduced it down to about half that number. So then we had to further look at the results. And so we evaluated the terms for frequency, so how often it showed up from the member templates, as well as location. So were these terms to be defined in the glossary of a PVA, or were they actually discussed within the body of the PVA? And also for relevance as well. So whether the term was actually related to the PVA, or actually was it a term that you would find in the main commercial agreement instead. From there, we reduced it down, and then we worked on the definitions. So we collected definitions from the member companies. We also then reviewed and recorded the relevant regulations and guidances. And as a team, we worked together to draft TransCelerate definitions. And we launched the glossary late last year with 30 terms. And I'm happy to say that we are now on version 2, which just launched a few weeks ago and now has 37 terms. And the additional terms are related to device components. We can move to the next slide. So let's take a quick look inside the glossary. We like to call it comprehensive yet nimble. So you can see there is the navigation pane on the left-hand side. So if you click on the bookmark icon, it will open up the bookmarks. And from there, you can click on the library of terms and filters. You can move to the next slide, please. And when you do that, it opens up the list of the key PVA terms, which you can see on the left-hand side. Now, all of those terms are hyperlinks. So if you were to click on the term, so in this case, adverse event, this will take you to the TransCelerate key definition, which you see on the upper right-hand side. And you can see that the term there is also a hyperlink. So if you were to click on adverse event, it will then take you to the addendum of methods and supporting information. And these were used for the development of the TransCelerate definition. We can move to the next slide. We can take a closer look at the addendum. So if you look in section 1, we have the product type and applicable life cycle listed for the term. In section 2, you have the supportive references that were used to create the definitions. So in this case, you can see that we have references from the US as well as ICH, ISO standards, and also EU regs as well. In section 3, we have synonyms to the key term. And in section 4, we have associated terms. So these are terms that are either related to the key definition or their subterms from the key term. And then moving on to section 5, you have the TransCelerate definition there. And then in section 6, where applicable, we would have the regional definition. So the definitions from the EU, US, and or Japan. And then going to 7, as you can see in the associated terms, if that term is actually one of the key terms in the glossary, it's actually hyperlinked and it will take you to that term. So if we can move to the next slide. You can see here, if you click on device reportable event, it will take you to the definition on the left-hand side. And then again, there's the hyperlink for the title. So if you were to click on that, it will take you to the addendum for device reportable event. And under associated terms, you can see that we have adverse event. And if you were to click on that, it will take you back to the beginning and the original definition. So great. Can we move to the next slide? As I mentioned in the beginning, we have a new version of the glossary, and that's because we know things are need to be changed on things, and we will be updating the solutions. So when we do update the solutions, you can see that there will be a version history that is attached. So here you can see in the version history for the glossary, we have the change summary. So for version 2, you can see the added terms listed there, as well as the editorial and formatting changes that were made in that version. You have the version number, and you also have the effective date of that version, so you know when the version was updated. Okay, move to the next slide. And I just wanted to give a couple of examples of potentially how the glossary might be used. So in the first scenario, we have navigating an unfamiliar PV area. So we have a PVA manager, and they've just received a new main agreement, and it involves a combination product that has a device. And this is a completely new area for them. So they've decided to use a glossary solution to review the device terms in there. We can move on. So the outcome there is that they were better prepared for the negotiation. I mean, the manager was able to save time because instead of having to go and search for relevant definitions as well as references and regulations, they could go into the glossary, look at the terms, go into the addendum, and find that information as well. This, in turn, helped facilitate a more efficient review because they were better prepared. And that made it a much easier review with the business partner. So, right. If we can move on. And here to my second example of how you might be able to use the glossary. The situation is there's a disagreement on a definition in a PVA. So you have the two partners there, and there's a lack of alignment on a definition in the PVA, and it's delaying the negotiations. So they are at an impasse. So both parties have agreed to review the glossary solution as it's an independent and trusted source. So we can move on. So as you can see, they've reviewed the TransCelerate definition, and they've also looked at the addendum, at the supporting information as well for that definition. And if we can move to the next slide, please. And the outcome is, after the review, they're able to gain alignment at the definition. So they were able to use the addendum, and using the sources, they agreed that they were happy with the glossary definition. They've used it and they finalized the PVA. And the next steps potentially was to look at their own internal glossaries and see if those might need to be updated as well to avoid any future misalignment with other business partners. Great. Next slide. And that brings me to the end of the glossary, and I'll hand it over to Jean to give a summary. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, so if we move to the next slide. So in the poll questions, we saw as well that our current state at the moment is that we have many challenges across industry with PV agreements. You saw a list of them at the beginning, and we're challenged with the negotiations, the templates, the agreement of the template. So across industry, we have a lot of challenges. Also, we don't actually have regulatory guidance for PV agreements, but do we really want them? We have to put information into our PV agreements that is aligned with regulatory guidance, because we have to do those with our partners. But do we want those guidance, or would it be something that we want to develop as industry that is flexible enough across companies that we could use, but it's organized? So the other thing that we did as a team was actually take a look at the literature, and there's virtually none in the last 20, 25 years or more. We got a handful of references, and only 2 of them produced something that was about 20 years ago about PV agreements. So there's not really much work being done on an area of pharmacovigilance that is actually probably gives us quite a headache from time to time. And also now we've got this continuously evolving environment. We saw through COVID how things had to move a lot faster. We've got a lot of different products now. We've got advanced therapies. We've got devices, software as a medical device. We've got lots of different things that we need to move faster, and companies are wanting to move faster and faster to get partners aligned. So let's have a look at the next slide, where what have we done? We collaborated, I mentioned earlier, across many companies to bring together the information and content into this space that you've seen this afternoon. We've developed a flexible toolbox that can be used across companies of different sizes, different partnerships, different levels of expertise. And also we have started to incorporate some information in some of the tools about devices. So moving to the next slide, what are the benefits? What is the use and what are the benefits? You've heard as we've gone through the different tools how we can potentially use those tools, but it may reduce drafting and negotiation timelines. It could help us, therefore, actually, and Jennifer mentioned this too, around improving our timelines, reducing the risk of delays for our key milestones. And ultimately, if agreements aren't in place, we may delay clinical trial starts, launches, and asset transfer. And the aim is to actually improve that. It may increase awareness of considerations impacting the PV agreements development. So challenges that we have, things that we can negotiate that may not need so much negotiation. We saw that it could also, the toolbox can serve as a resource for end-to-end PV process. We thought that it could engage, newly engage in PV activities, or where there's a PV licensing function doesn't exist, and this toolbox could potentially be used. It may also support the improvement in accuracy and completeness of the PV agreement. And we've talked a lot about supporting negotiations and timelines, but there's also better support of compliance to the PV agreement, which could potentially help us in audits and inspections. And also that faster data, more comprehensive data exchange, for example, with signaling and surveillance. But really, the last bullet point there is the most important one that is central to this whole project and all of us working in pharmacovigilance. It's really better supporting the patient and patient safety and getting information out there faster. So let's move on to the next slide. So what can you do? Hopefully this afternoon, please use that opportunity to start to use the tools to foster communication in PV agreements, similar means of communication. Look at different ways of using the tools to develop them further. And please share your feedback with us, because we want to continue to improve and develop this toolbox. And we would really appreciate your feedback as well as you start to use it, or if you've got any questions or why you wouldn't want to use it. So let's move on to the next slide. And that gives you means of communicating with TransCelerate. And then move to the next slide, please. So what next? We've actually got, you saw earlier, three quarters of the circle. This is the last quarter, and this is the benchmarking of safety data exchange timelines and PV agreements. So the launch target of this is early next year. And this comes from a result of a TransCelerate member company survey. This may help the user to identify clusters of more common or the most common exchange number of days for some types of ICSRs. It's also intended to be interpreted by the reader in the context of your own guidance, your own process, your own understanding of what's going on with that exchange. And it's not intended to recommend standard or optimal timelines for exchange of safety data, but does give that information from the survey. So it leaves me now to say thank you very much. And we have come in directly on time. I don't think we've got any more slides, just on time for the Q&A. So thank you very much to everybody that's listened this afternoon, and we're looking forward to an interactive session of questions and answers.
Great. Thank you, Jean. At this time, we're going to transition to our question and answer session. My name is Jill Horvath, and I'm the project manager for the PVAO initiative. Before moving to our Q&A, I'd like to take a moment to thank our speakers for the countless hours they've put into this project and developing this webinar. I would also like to take a moment to introduce and thank our panelists that are joining us today. Yvonne Gibble, the Executive Director, Pharmacovigilance Licensing from Merck. Catherine Corbel-Ecolard, Global Patient Safety Director, Patient Safety Agreement Management from Amgen. And Robin Schutz, SCEA Manager, PV Agreements and Operations from Sanofi, who will join our presenters to respond to your questions. We've got some questions that we've received in advance,